The fire had a name, and that name was Theodore Blake. The woman inside the burning house didn't know it yet, but the man watching from the shadows, the man with the silver ring glinting in the firelight, was the source of it all. The flames licked at the walls like a hungry dog, swallowing the home she'd built, the life she'd known. Smoke clawed at her throat, thick and black. She clutched her son tighter, his small body trembling against hers. Outside, a horse galloped away, its hoofbeats a fading drum of doom. "Listen to me," she choked out, her voice a raw whisper against the roar of the inferno. "You run. You run to the creek and you hide." The boy's eyes, wide with a terror no child should ever know, were fixed on her face. Tears cut clean paths through the soot staining his cheeks. "Mama, no, come with me." She shook her head, a final desperate act of love. Lifting him to the broken window, she lied. "I'll be right behind you." The fire had already sealed her fate. Her escape was gone, devoured by the flames. All that was left was him, her son, her hope. She pushed him through the opening, their eyes locking one last time. In that silent, searing moment, everything she was, everything she loved, passed into him. He dropped to the soft earth outside, hesitating, looking back at the face of his mother, framed by fire. "Go!" she screamed, a sound that tore from the depths of her soul as the roof above her began to groan, to splinter, to fall. "Run and don't look back!" And the boy ran, his small legs pumped, carrying him away from the only home he'd ever had, away from the monster in the trees, away from his mother's final scream. The man with the silver ring watched the small figure disappear into the darkness. He watched the house collapse into a roaring pile of ash and memory. Then, satisfied, he turned and melted back into the night. But he made one mistake. One tiny, fatal mistake. He thought the boy was just a boy. He didn't realize he had just created a witness, a living piece of evidence that would one day come back to burn him down. Mason Reed's eyes snapped open. Sweat slicked his skin, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The nightmare was always the same. Not his memory, but a scene his mind had pieced together from cold case files and whispers in the dark. The night Sarah Thompson died. The night the law called it an accident. Mason knew better. The law could be wrong. The law could be bought. He swung his legs out of bed, the floorboards of his isolated cabin creaking in the pre-dawn stillness. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated his world. A table, a chair, and a trunk full of a life he'd tried to bury. On the wall hung a single sketch, his wife Catherine. Her face, captured in charcoal by her own hand, was a constant, painful reminder of everything he had lost. He reached for the whiskey bottle. It was his only other companion these days. He took a long pull, the burn in his throat a familiar punishment. 5 years. 5 years since he traded his federal marshal's badge for this self-imposed prison on the edge of Ash Hollow. 5 years of the town's whispers following him like a shadow. The man who let his wife burn. They didn't know the truth. Hell, some days Mason wasn't sure he knew it either. He'd once believed in the system, in justice. Now the lines etched on his face told a story of a man who had seen the system for what it was. A machine with gears that could be greased by money and power. Sleep was a lost cause now. The nightmare had seen to that. He pulled on his clothes and stepped out onto the porch. The cool air was a small mercy. Dawn was still an hour away. He'd fix the chicken coop, chop some wood, anything to keep the ghosts at bay. He walked to the well, the routine a comfort in its mindlessness. As he lowered the bucket, his eyes caught something on the ground. A dark stain on the packed earth, still tacky to the touch. Blood. The lawman in him, the part he'd tried to kill with whiskey and isolation, roared back to life. His eyes, steel gray and sharp, scanned the ground. A trail, small droplets, leading from his well toward the deep pine forest that bordered his property. Someone was here. Someone was hurt. He didn't hesitate. He went back inside, strapped on the Colt that had been his other half for 15 years, and grabbed his hat. The familiar weight at his hip was a ghost of the man he used to be. A man who followed blood trails for a living. The forest was quiet, the early morning light filtering through the pines like stained glass. Mason moved with a silence born of years hunting men who didn't want to be found. The trail was faint, but he didn't lose it. It led him deeper, a quarter mile, then a half. It ended at a massive, hollowed-out log, a dead giant resting on the forest floor. The stillness around the log was unnatural. It was the silence of something holding its breath. Mason's hand rested on the grip of his Colt. "I know you're in there," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." Silence, but his trained eye caught it. A flicker of movement inside the log's dark mouth. A shadow shifting within a shadow. "You're bleeding," Mason said, taking a deliberate step back. "It's cold. I've got food and bandages at my cabin. You can have them. No questions asked." The silence stretched, thick with tension. Then a small, grimy face appeared at the opening. A boy, no more than 10, with eyes that looked 100 years old. Eyes filled with a wild, cornered animal fear. His clothes were rags, stained with dirt and blood. A nasty cut on his arm was crusted over, the skin around it an angry red. "What's your name?" Mason asked, keeping his voice soft. The boy just stared, his haunted eyes weighing Mason, judging him, searching for the lie. "Are you hungry?" Mason tried again. "I can fix that arm for you." The boy's gaze darted to his injury, then back to Mason. A flicker of something, calculation, desperation, crossed his face. "He'll kill me," the boy whispered, his voice so faint it was almost lost in the breeze. "He'll kill me if he finds me." A chill, cold and sharp, went down Mason's spine. "Who will?" The boy shrank back into the log, his voice trembling. "The man with the silver ring." The world tilted under Mason's feet. The silver ring, the glint of metal in the firelight from his nightmare. It couldn't be. It was impossible. "He killed my mama," the boy whispered, tears finally breaking free, tracing paths through the dirt on his face. "He killed her in a fire, and if he finds me, he'll kill me too." Mason felt the ghosts of the past 5 years rise up and wrap their cold hands around his throat. A boy, a fire, a man with a silver ring. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a reckoning. "I won't tell anyone you're here," Mason promised, his voice more certain than he'd felt in years. "You have my word." The boy studied him from the darkness of the log, his old eyes searching for the trap. "Everyone lies." "Not everyone," Mason said quietly. "My name is Mason Reed. I used to be a lawman. Now I just live out here." "Why alone?" The boy shot back, a spark of defiance in his voice. The question hit Mason like a punch to the gut. His jaw tightened. "My wife died. In a fire. The people in town. They think I could have stopped it." Something shifted in the boy's gaze. A flicker of recognition. The shared language of loss. He inched forward just a little. "I can't make you trust me," Mason said, his voice raw with a truth he rarely spoke aloud. "But I won't hurt you, and I won't let him hurt you. That's a promise." A long moment passed. The forest held its breath. Then slowly the boy crawled out of the log. He was a scarecrow of a child, thin to the point of breaking, but he stood on his own 2 feet. Up close, Mason could see the exhaustion carved into his young face, but also a core of steel that had refused to shatter. "Can you walk?" Mason asked. The boy gave a single jerky nod. They walked back to the cabin in silence, the boy keeping a careful, measured distance. When the cabin came into view, he stopped, his eyes darting around the clearing, assessing threats. "Just me and the chickens," Mason assured him. "No one ever comes out this way." Inside, Mason moved with slow, deliberate motions, keeping his hands in sight. He set a thick slice of cornbread and a cup of water on the table. The boy attacked the food like a starving wolf, his eyes never leaving Mason, as if he expected the food to be snatched away at any second. Mason gathered bandages and a jar of honey. "My wife kept bees," he heard himself say, the words strange in the quiet room. "She said honey helps wounds heal clean." The boy's gaze shot to the sketch of Catherine on the wall. "She drew that," Mason nodded. "She was an artist." "Did the man with the silver ring kill her too?" the boy asked, his mouth full of cornbread. The question was so direct, so brutal, it knocked the air from Mason's lungs. "Why? Why would you ask that?" The boy shrugged, his eyes dropping back to his empty plate. "You look sad. Like my mama looked, before the fire. Mason didn't have an answer. The boy's innocent question had sliced right through 5 years of whiskey and denial, exposing a wound Mason had refused to examine. The possibility that Catherine's death wasn't an accident, that it was connected to Sarah Thompson's, that it was murder. "Let me see that arm," Mason said, changing the subject. The boy held out his arm. As Mason cleaned the wound, he saw it. The shape of the cut wasn't random. It was a perfect crescent, a half moon, a brand. And Mason had seen it before. Years ago, on another victim. A mark left by a custom-made ring with a sharpened decorative edge. A ring worn by one man, Theodore Blake, the son of Judge Harrison Blake, the most powerful and untouchable man in Ash Hollow County. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The nightmare, the boy, the fire. This wasn't just a random child who'd stumbled onto his property. This was a ghost from the case that had destroyed him, the case that had cost him Catherine. "This might sting," Mason said, his voice tight, as he applied the honey and wrapped the arm. The boy didn't even flinch. "What's your name?" Mason asked again. Silence. "I have to call you something," Mason said. "How about Caleb? It was my grandfather's name. He was a brave man." The boy tested the name on his tongue, his expression unreadable. "Caleb," he repeated softly. "You can stay here, Caleb," Mason told him, his mind already racing, calculating, the old instincts firing up. "There's a cot in the back. No one will find you here." That night Mason watched Caleb, or whatever his real name was, devour 2 bowls of stew. The warmth and food seemed to melt some of the tension from his small frame. When Mason showed him to the back room, the boy climbed onto the cot fully clothed, pulling the blanket to his chin like a shield. As Mason turned to leave, the boy's voice stopped him. "Mr. Reed?" Mason turned back. "Thank you," Caleb whispered. The words sounded like they'd been dug up from somewhere deep and long buried. Mason just nodded and pulled the door partway shut. He sat at the table for hours, the whiskey bottle untouched. The boy's arrival had shattered his quiet, miserable existence. It had dragged the past, kicking and screaming, right onto his doorstep. The silver ring, the crescent-shaped scar, Theodore Blake. 5 years ago, Mason had come to Ash Hollow to investigate Blake for a series of brutal assaults. Women had come forward, ranchers' wives, a young widow. Each time, Judge Blake had swept it away. Witnesses vanished, evidence disappeared. One of those witnesses had been Sarah Thompson. She worked at the Blake estate, she had a son, and she was ready to testify. Then the fire, ruled an accident, case closed. 3 months later, another fire, another accident. His home, his Catherine. He tried to connect them, but the walls went up. The system he'd served turned on him. No evidence, no witnesses. He'd resigned, retreated, and let the truth be buried in ashes. Now a boy named Caleb had just handed him a shovel. Taking this boy in was a death sentence. For both of them. If Theodore Blake was hunting him, he wouldn't stop. He'd tear the county apart to find him. But looking at the half-closed door to the back room, Mason knew he didn't have a choice. This wasn't just about protecting a child. It was about digging up the dead. It was about avenging his wife. It was about finishing the fight he had run away from 5 years ago. And this time, he wasn't going to lose. The next morning, the cot in the back room was empty. For a heart-stopping second, Mason thought the boy had bolted. Then he saw him. Caleb was sitting on the porch steps, watching the sun rise, a small, still figure against the vastness of the mountains. He looked like he belonged to the wilderness, a wild thing temporarily tamed. Mason joined him, leaving a respectful distance between them. They sat in silence, watching the gold and purple lights spill across the valley. "I have to go into town for supplies," Mason said, breaking the quiet. "You'll be safe here. I'll lock the door. I'll be back before sundown." Caleb just nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Will you still be here when I get back?" Mason asked. It was a risk, asking for a promise from a boy who had no reason to give one. Caleb turned and looked at him, his expression impossible to read. "Where else would I go?" It was the honest answer of a boy with nowhere left to run. It was enough. As Mason saddled his horse, Sadie, he glanced back. Caleb was by the chicken coop, watching the birds peck at the dirt with a quiet intensity. For a moment, he just looked like a normal kid. It was a sight that tugged at something deep inside Mason, something he thought had died with Catherine, a sense of purpose. Ash Hollow hadn't changed. The main street was the same dusty stretch of false front buildings, all sitting under the watchful eye of the imposing courthouse where Judge Blake handed down his own version of justice. Mason tied Sadie outside the general store. The bell above the door jingled, and Eleanor Parker looked up. Her weathered face, lined with her own history of sorrow, broke into a genuine smile. Mason Reed. Twice in a month. The world must be ending. Not yet, Eleanor, just running low. Eleanor had been one of the few who hadn't treated him like a pariah after Catherine's death. Her quiet kindness had been a lifeline. As she gathered his usual order, flour, coffee, ammunition, Mason added what he'd really come for. And some boys' clothes if you have any, and more bandages. Eleanor's hand paused over her ledger. Her sharp eyes met his. Boys' clothes? Found an injured fox kit, Mason lied, the words feeling clumsy and obvious. Thought I'd try to patch it up. Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, knowing nod. Of course, a fox kit. I've got just the thing. As she wrapped his purchases, her voice dropped. Been some excitement in town. Theodore Blake is offering a reward. $200 for information about his missing nephew. Mason's blood ran cold. Nephew? Says the boy ran off from the family estate. Eleanor continued, her back to him. Says the boy is troubled. Dangerous even. Started a fire, he claims. It was a lie, a masterfully cruel one. Blake was painting Caleb as the villain, turning the whole county into a posse of bounty hunters. Seems strange, Mason said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. Describing a child that way. Eleanor leaned closer, her voice a whisper. Stranger still, since no one in this town ever knew Theodore Blake had a nephew, not until he disappeared. She looked him straight in the eye. Be careful, Mason. The Blakes don't like losing their property. The warning was clear. She knew, or she suspected. As Mason loaded the supplies onto Sadie, he felt a pair of eyes on him. Across the street, Sheriff Everett Howard stood watching. They'd been friends once before the fires, before justice in Ash Hollow had become a commodity for sale. Howard gave a hesitant nod. Mason returned it. The space between them felt a mile wide. Then a sleek black carriage rolled past, kicking up dust. Through the window, Mason saw him, Theodore Blake, impeccably dressed, an arrogant smirk on his handsome face, and on his hand, the silver ring. It caught the sun, flashing like a signal of death. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, a flicker of recognition and contempt in Blake's eyes. Then the carriage was gone, leaving Mason with a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The game had started, and Blake knew he was a player. When Mason got back to the cabin, he found Caleb hunched over the table. He had Catherine's old sketchbook open, a piece of charcoal in his small hand. He was trying to copy one of her drawings of a horse. He looked up, guilt and fear on his face. I found it in the chest. I didn't break it. It's okay, Mason said, setting down the supplies. Catherine would have wanted someone to use it. The boy's drawing was rough, but the talent was undeniable. He had an artist's eye. You have a gift, Mason said. Caleb shrugged, but he traced the drawing with a reverence that spoke volumes. My mama. She said I could be an artist one day. It was the first piece of himself the boy had offered freely. Mason didn't push. He just unpacked the new clothes. These might be a bit big, but they're clean. Caleb stared at the clothes, then back at Mason, the old suspicion returning to his eyes. Why? Why are you helping me? Mason sat down at the table across from him. He owed the boy the truth, or at least part of it. Because someone should, and because I think I knew your mother. Caleb went rigid. The charcoal stick in his hand snapped. How? I was a federal marshal. 5 years ago, I investigated a case here. A woman named Sarah Thompson was a witness. Mason watched the boy's face. The name hit him like a physical blow. She worked at the Blake estate, and she had a son. She also had a cut on her arm, shaped like a half moon, the same as yours. Caleb's breathing became shallow. rapid. His eyes were wide with terror. Are you, are you going to take me back to him? No, Mason said, his voice hard as iron. Never. He leaned forward, forcing the boy to meet his gaze. I'm telling you this so you understand. I know who you're running from, and I know why. A single tear rolled down Caleb's cheek. You knew my mama. I met her, Mason said gently. She was brave. She was going to testify against Theodore Blake. And then she died, Caleb finished, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Yes, Mason said. Then she died. The unspoken words hung between them in the silent cabin. Just like my wife. My wife was helping her, Mason added, the confession costing him more than Caleb could ever know. Catherine believed her. She was trying to find other women Blake had hurt. Understanding dawned in Caleb's old eyes, a terrible, soul-crushing understanding that no child should possess. And then your wife died too. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Mason's throat was tight. 3 months after your mother, another fire, another accident. Caleb looked from Mason's grief-stricken face to the drawing of Catherine on the wall. It wasn't an accident, was it? No, Mason said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. I don't believe it was. The boy looked down at the broken charcoal in his hand. That's why you live out here. Because you know, but you can't prove it. The simple, brutal truth, spoken by a 10-year-old boy, hit Mason harder than any accusation ever had. He had run. He had hidden. He had let the Blakes win. Yes, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. That's why. Caleb looked up, his gaze steady. So what happens now? The question hung in the air. The answer was simple. The answer was terrifying. The answer was the one thing Mason had been avoiding for 5 long years. Now, Mason said, a fire he thought long dead beginning to smolder in his gut. Now we prove it. That night, a storm broke inside the cabin. Mason was jolted awake by a scream. Not a child's cry, but a raw, terrified shriek that ripped through the darkness. He bolted from his bed and burst into the back room. Caleb was thrashing in his cot, tangled in the blanket, fighting an enemy only he could see. Caleb, wake up! You're safe! Mason grabbed the boy's shoulders, trying to anchor him to the real world. Caleb's eyes flew open, wild and unfocused. He's here! The man with the ring! He's in the house! No one's here but us, Mason said, his voice a low, calming rumble. You were dreaming. You're safe. Slowly, the terror receded from the boy's eyes, replaced by a haunting memory. His body was still trembling. I saw him, he whispered, standing over my bed, smiling, just like he did that night. The dam broke. The words came pouring out, a torrent of horror that Caleb had held back for years. He used to come to Mama's room, at the big house, at night. I would hear her crying. She told me to hide if he ever came looking for me. She said he would hurt me like he hurt her. Mason's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his face a neutral mask, letting the boy talk. The night of the fire, I heard them fighting. She said she was leaving. She said she was going to tell everyone what he did to her. He just laughed. He said no one would ever believe a servant over the son of a judge. Caleb's eyes were fixed on a point in the dark, reliving the nightmare. I woke up to the smoke. Mama was there. She pulled me to the window. She pushed me out. She told me to run. His voice broke, a sob catching in his throat. I saw him, Mr. Reed. When I looked back, I saw him watching from the trees. He saw me too, and he was still smiling. A cold, murderous rage filled Mason, a rage he hadn't felt since he'd stood in the smoking ruins of his own home. He wanted to find Theodore Blake and tear him apart with his bare hands. But that wasn't justice. That was vengeance. And this boy, this child who had seen hell, deserved justice. You did what your mother wanted, Mason said, his voice thick with emotion. You survived, and you're not alone anymore. Caleb looked up at him, a fragile hope warring with a lifetime of fear. Will you help me? Really help me? Mason knelt by the cot, looking the boy straight in the eye. I will help you get justice for your mother. I swear it on my wife's grave. The promise was a vow, a declaration of war against the most powerful family in the county, a war they would almost certainly lose, but it had to be fought. Try to sleep, Mason said. As he turned to leave, Caleb's voice stopped him. Mr. Reed, thank you for believing me. The words echoed in Mason's mind as he lay awake for the rest of the night, the whiskey bottle on the floor, forgotten. Believing the boy wasn't enough. He had to make others believe him. He had to find a crack in the wall of power the Blakes had built around themselves. The time for hiding was over. The time for hunting had begun. The next morning, as Mason strapped on his gun belt, Caleb watched him with a new understanding. The fear was still there, but it was overlaid with something else. Resolve. You're going back to town, he stated. I have to, Mason said. There are people I need to talk to. Questions that need answers. What if someone comes here while you're gone? Mason walked to the fireplace and pried loose a stone in the hearth. Behind it was a small, hidden cavity. Inside was a compact two-shot Derringer, Catherine's gun. You hide, Mason said, pointing to a loose floorboard under a rug in the pantry. You get in there, and you don't make a sound. This, he said, holding up the small pistol, is only if they find you, only if there's no other choice. Do you understand? Caleb nodded, his eyes wide as he looked at the gun. A 10-year-old boy shouldn't have to know how to use a pistol. But Caleb wasn't a normal 10-year-old boy. He was a survivor. The ride to town felt different. Mason wasn't a broken man seeking supplies anymore. He was a hunter on the prowl. His first stop was Eleanor Parker's store. He needed more than just supplies, he needed an ally. He found her stocking shelves, her movements efficient and practiced. Back so soon? She asked, a knowing look in her eyes. I need your help, Eleanor, Mason said, cutting straight to the point. They talked in the back room, over cups of steaming coffee. Mason didn't tell her everything, but he told her enough. He told her about the boy. He told her about the scar. Eleanor listened without interruption. When he was finished, she let out a long, slow breath. I knew it, she whispered. I always knew that fire wasn't an accident. Mason leaned forward. What do you know? The night Sarah Thompson died, Eleanor said, her voice dropping. I was coming back late from a delivery. I saw a rider leaving the woods near her house, riding like the devil was on his heels. She looked Mason dead in the eye. It was Theodore Blake. I saw his face clear as day in the moonlight. The confirmation was a jolt of electricity. Did you tell the sheriff? A bitter smile twisted Eleanor's lips. I tried. The next day, Judge Blake himself paid me a visit. Talked about how my store's lease was up for renewal. Asked me if I was sure what I'd seen. He didn't have to say another word. My statement disappeared. This was it. The first crack in the wall. A credible witness. Would you testify now? Eleanor hesitated, the fear of the Blakes warring with the guilt she'd carried for 5 years. It would be my word against theirs. They own this county, Mason. They don't own the truth, Mason countered, and they don't own me. He told her about Luis Mendoza and Tom, the stable boy, 2 other potential witnesses who had fled Ash Hollow. Eleanor's eyes lit up with a spark of something Mason hadn't seen before. Hope. Luis Mendoza. I heard he was working a silver claim up near Bear Creek, north of here. It's rough country. It was a lead. A dangerous, long shot of a lead, but it was more than he'd had in 5 years. As he was leaving, Eleanor grabbed his arm. There's something else, she said, her voice urgent. After your Catherine. After the fire, I was helping clean out the wreckage of the general store. The fire had spread, you remember. In the alley behind, I found something. It must have fallen from the attacker's pocket. She pressed a small cloth-wrapped object into his hand. I was afraid to come forward. I buried it. But you might be able to use it. Mason unwrapped the cloth. Lying in his palm was a silver cufflink, intricately engraved with a family crest, the Blake family crest, physical evidence, tying one of the Blakes to the scene of his wife's murder. The ground had shifted. This wasn't just about testimony anymore. This was about proof, hard, undeniable proof. He stepped out of the store, his mind reeling. As he moved to his horse, a voice stopped him. Mason. It was Sheriff Howard. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes were filled with a weary conflict. A word, he said, his voice low. Not here. My house. Tonight. After dark. Before Mason could answer, Howard turned and walked away. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. Or a trap. Mason didn't care. He had a witness. He had physical evidence. And he had a destination. Bear Creek. As he rode out of town, he felt those eyes on him again. He looked up at the courthouse. Theodore Blake was standing on the steps, watching him go. A slow, arrogant smile spread across his face as he raised his hand. The silver ring on his finger caught the sun, a final, mocking glint. Mason didn't flinch. He just held Blake's gaze, a silent promise passing between them. I'm coming for you. The cabin felt different when Mason returned. It was no longer just a hideout. It was a war room. Caleb was waiting, his face etched with anxiety. Did you find anything? He asked, his voice a hopeful whisper. Mason laid the silver cufflink on the table. He told Caleb about Eleanor Parker, about her seeing Theodore Blake near the fire. He told him about the lead on Luis Mendoza. For the first time since Mason had found him, a flicker of something other than fear appeared in the boy's eyes. It was the faint, fragile glow of hope. So we have proof? Caleb asked, his small hand hovering over the cufflink, not daring to touch it. We have a start, Mason said, but it's not enough, not yet. We need Luis. If he'll talk, his testimony combined with Eleanor's could be enough to force an outside investigation. The plan was forming, dangerous and uncertain, but it was a plan. That night, Mason had to meet with Sheriff Howard. He didn't trust the man, not anymore, but he couldn't ignore the summons. It could be a trap, or it could be the one thing he didn't expect, an offer of help. I have to go out again, Mason told Caleb. Just for a little while. He saw the fear return to the boy's eyes. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone. If you hear anything, get to the hiding spot. Caleb nodded, his jaw set with a grim determination. Be careful, he said, the words of a child forced to be an adult too soon. Mason approached the sheriff's house from the back, moving through the shadows like a ghost. Howard was waiting for him in the dimly lit kitchen. The air was thick with tension. You're taking a big risk, Mason, Howard said, his voice low. I know you have the boy. Mason didn't confirm or deny it. Why the meeting, Everett? You here to arrest me or to warn me? Howard let out a long, tired sigh. He looked like a man being crushed under a great weight. Theodore Blake is tearing this county apart looking for that boy. He's obsessed, and Judge Blake is letting him. He looked up, his eyes filled with a shame so deep it seemed to have carved the lines on his face. I've done things, Mason, things I'm not proud of, to protect my family. I looked the other way when Sarah Thompson died. I buried the evidence from your wife's fire. The confession hung in the air, a poison that had been sickening their town for years. Why tell me now? Mason asked, his voice cold as ice. Because they have something on me, Howard admitted, something that could ruin my family. I've been their dog on a leash for 5 years. But there's a limit. A man can only stomach so much. He slid a piece of paper across the table. This is why Blake is so obsessed. This is what he's really afraid of. Mason picked it up. It was a copy of a birth certificate. The mother's name was Sarah Thompson. The father's name was listed as unknown. But at the bottom in Howard's own handwriting was a single explosive sentence. Paternity privately acknowledged by Theodore Blake. The room spun. Caleb wasn't just a witness to his mother's murder. He was the son of the murderer, a Blake. The one secret, the one piece of leverage that could bring the entire dynasty crashing down. Does the boy know? Howard asked. No, Mason said, his mind reeling. And he's not going to. Not from me. Blake won't stop until he has him, Howard warned. He can't afford to let that secret out. He's got men watching your cabin right now. They're just waiting for the order. The trap had been sprung. Get the boy and run, Mason, Howard urged. It's the only way. Disappear. Mason looked at the birth certificate in his hand. He looked at the face of his former friend, a man broken by compromise, and he thought of the boy, waiting for him in the cabin, a boy who had been running his whole life. Running was what the Blakes wanted. Running meant they won. Again. No, Mason said, his voice ringing with a newfound certainty. The running stops tonight. He slid the cuff link across the table. This was found behind the general store the night Catherine died. Howard stared at the Blake family crest. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. His face went pale. I can't help you officially, Howard whispered, his eyes darting toward the window. But I can buy you time. A few hours. I'll send Blake's men on a wild goose chase to the South Ridge. It's all I can do. It was enough. Mason slipped out the back door and ran. Not away from the fight, but toward it. The night air was cold against his face, but a fire was burning inside him. He had to get to Caleb. He had to get them out of the cabin before Blake's men realized they'd been tricked. When he burst into the cabin, Caleb was huddled by the cold fireplace, the small derringer clutched in his hands. We have to go, Mason said, grabbing a saddlebag and stuffing it with food, ammunition, and Catherine's sketchbook. Now, he explained as they saddled Sadie in the dark, his words coming in quick, urgent bursts. He didn't tell Caleb about his father. He couldn't. Not now. He just told him that Blake's men were coming. As they rode away from the cabin, leaving the last 5 years of Mason's life behind, Caleb looked back. Will we ever come back? No, Mason said. The cabin had been a prison of his own making. Now he was free, and he had a new purpose. Where are we going? Caleb asked, his small body pressed against Mason's for warmth. Bear Creek, Mason answered, turning the horse toward the rugged northern mountains. We're going to find a man named Luis Mendoza. We're going to get his story, and then we're going to hunt the hunters. Pampirtan. Their path was lit only by a sliver of moon. Behind them, Ash Hollow slept, unaware of the war that had just been declared. Ahead lay a dangerous journey and an uncertain future. But for the first time in 5 years, Mason Reed wasn't looking back. He was riding forward with the son of his enemy at his back, on a quest for the one thing that had been denied to them all. Justice. The journey to Bear Creek was a brutal 2-day ride through unforgiving wilderness. They pushed Sadie to her limit, sticking to game trails and rocky ravines, avoiding roads where Blake's men might be waiting. The mountains were a silent, watchful enemy, their jagged peaks tearing at the sky. Caleb was quiet, his small frame absorbing the punishing pace without complaint. He was a ghost of a boy, forged in fire and fear, and Mason saw in him a resilience that was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. During a brief stop to water the horse, Caleb spoke, his voice small against the vast emptiness. My real name is Daniel. The admission was so sudden, so simple, it caught Mason off guard. My mama called me Danny, he continued, not looking at Mason. It was our secret. He was offering Mason a piece of himself, a piece of the life that had been stolen from him. It was an act of trust so profound it made Mason's chest ache. Daniel, Mason said, testing the name. It's a good name. He paused. But I've gotten used to Caleb. It's the name of the boy who saved my life. Can I keep calling you that? Daniel, Caleb, looked up, and for the first time Mason saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. It can be our secret. They reached the outskirts of the Bear Creek mining camp at dusk on the second day. It was a chaotic collection of tents and crude shacks, clinging to the side of a mountain, populated by hard men with tired eyes who were chasing a dream deep in the earth. Finding Luis Mendoza here would be like finding a specific rock in a landslide. Mason's cautious questions were met with suspicion and silence. These men didn't trust outsiders, and they certainly didn't trust anyone asking about one of their own. The name Ash Hollow closed doors and hardened faces. Luis was being protected. Dejected, Mason was about to give up for the night when Caleb tugged on his sleeve. Mr. Reed, look. He pointed to a small, isolated cabin higher up the mountain, smoke curling from its chimney. On the porch, a man was carving a piece of wood. The way he holds the knife, Caleb whispered. Luis taught me how to do that. He said you let the wood tell you what it wants to be. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. They approached the cabin cautiously. As they drew closer, the man on the porch looked up. His eyes widened, first at Mason, then they fell on Caleb. The carving knife dropped from his hand. Dios mío, he breathed, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. Daniel? They said, they said you died in the fire. It was Luis Mendoza. He ushered them inside, his eyes never leaving Caleb, as if the boy were an apparition that might vanish. The cabin was small but clean. Another man, younger, with sandy hair and haunted eyes, emerged from a back room. Tom? Mason said, recognizing him instantly. The stable boy from the Blake estate. The one who had disappeared the night Catherine died. The two witnesses he had been searching for. Together, hiding. The story came out in a rush. Luis had threatened Theodore Blake after seeing him abuse Sarah one too many times. Judge Blake's men had given him a choice. Leave the county or hang from a tree. He fled, but the guilt of leaving Sarah and Caleb behind had eaten him alive. Tom's story was even more chilling. The night your wife died, Marshall, he said, his voice trembling, I saw him. I saw Theodore Blake watching your house burn. He was standing in the shadows and he had this smile on his face. When he saw me, he just kept smiling. Tom had run for his life that night, eventually finding Luis. They had been hiding together ever since, two men bound by a terrible secret. But they hadn't just been hiding. We knew we couldn't go to the law, Luis said, his voice hard. The law belongs to the Blakes, so we started making our own case. He pulled up a loose floorboard and removed a metal box. Inside was a stack of letters tied with a ribbon. Sarah's letters, Luis explained, to her sister. She wrote about everything Theodore did to her. She named him. She was going to mail them the day after she escaped. It was a bombshell. Written testimony from the victim herself. And there's this, Tom said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished object. A silver flask. It was his, Blake's. He dropped it that night. I found it in the dirt near your house. On the bottom, initials were engraved. T.B. Mason stared at the evidence spread on the table. The letters, the flask, the cufflink, the testimony of these two men, the testimony of Eleanor Parker and Caleb. It was an avalanche, enough to bury the Blakes forever. But as hope surged through him, a sound from outside shattered the moment. The distinct sound of multiple horses approaching the cabin. They found us, Tom whispered, his face draining of color as he grabbed a rifle. Luis moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. It's him, he said, his voice a low growl. Blake is here. There was no escape. The cabin was surrounded. Theodore Blake's voice cut through the night, smooth and confident. Mason Reed, I know you're in there, and I know you have my nephew. Send the boy out, and I'll let the rest of you live. It was a lie. Mason knew it. Luis knew it. He won't stop, Luis said, checking the load in his own rifle. Not until we're all dead. Caleb, who had been silent, moved to Mason's side. He was trembling, but his eyes were clear. You can't let him take me, he said. I won't, Mason promised, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. He looked at Luis and Tom. They were trapped, outgunned, but they were not broken. He thinks he has us cornered, Mason said, the old fire of the lawman he used to be roaring to life. He thinks this is the end, but he's wrong. He looked at the evidence on the table, then at the faces of his unlikely allies. This isn't an end. It's a trial, and we're the jury. Outside, Theodore Blake laughed, a sound that curdled the blood. You're out of time, Reed. Mason raised his Colt, the weight of it familiar and steady in his hand. He looked at Caleb. Stay behind me. Then he kicked open the door and stepped out into the night. The final battle for justice in Ash Hollow had begun. The night exploded. Gunfire erupted from the darkness surrounding the cabin. Splinters flying from the doorframe next to Mason's head. He fired back, not aiming to hit, but to suppress, to force them to keep their heads down. Luis and Tom opened up from the windows, their rifle shots cracking through the night. They're trying to pin us down, Luis shouted over the din. Force us to waste ammunition. Mason knew he was right. This wasn't an assault. It was a siege. Blake was patient. He would wait them out, wait for the dawn, wait for them to run out of bullets and hope. He doesn't know about the root cellar, Tom yelled. The back entrance is hidden by the woodpile. It was a chance, a slim, desperate one. Tom, you and I give them a target from the front, Mason commanded. his mind working with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Luis, you take the boy. Get the evidence and go out the back. Circle around and get to their horses. Create a diversion. No, Caleb said, his voice firm. I'm not running. Not again. He was holding Catherine's small derringer, his hand surprisingly steady. This isn't running, Caleb, Mason said, looking the boy in the eye. It's fighting. We can't win from in here. We need to split them up, confuse them. You have to get that evidence out. It's the only thing that matters. Luis nodded, understanding. He's right, Daniel. Your mother's story must be told. We are just the messengers. He grabbed the metal box of letters and the other evidence, stuffing it into a saddlebag. Mason and Tom laid down a volley of covering fire. In the ensuing chaos, Luis and Caleb slipped out the back. The next few minutes were an eternity. The firing from Blake's men intensified, a relentless hailstorm of lead chewing the cabin to pieces. Mason and Tom moved from window to window, firing sparingly, making their 2 guns sound like 4. Then from the woods behind Blake's position came a shout, followed by 2 quick pistol shots, the derringer, and the sound of horses screaming in panic. The diversion. It was working. The gunfire from Blake's men faltered. They were confused, their line breaking as some of them turned to see what was happening. Now! Mason yelled. He and Tom burst from the cabin, firing as they ran, charging into the darkness toward the trees on the opposite side of the clearing. A bullet tore through Mason's left arm, a searing, white-hot pain, but he didn't stop. He stumbled, caught himself, and kept moving. They made it to the trees, diving behind a rock outcropping as bullets peppered the ground around them. The clearing fell silent. Then Blake's voice, now laced with fury, echoed through the woods. You can't escape, Reed. You're wounded. You're alone. But he wasn't alone. From the darkness, Caleb's voice, clear and strong, called out. He's not alone. Suddenly, the night erupted again, but this time, the shots were coming from all sides. Luis and Caleb, using the darkness and their knowledge of the terrain, were circling, firing, making their 2 guns sound like an army. Blake's men were caught in a crossfire, disoriented and panicked. Mason tied a strip of his shirt around his bleeding arm, his mind racing. This couldn't last. Blake would rally his men. They needed an advantage. And then he remembered something Catherine had once told him, something she'd read in a book about military strategy. Use the terrain as a weapon. He looked up at the steep, rocky hillside above them. It was littered with loose rocks and scree, held in place by little more than gravity. Tom, Mason yelled. Cover me. Luis, Caleb, keep them busy. He began to climb. The pain in his arm was a dull, throbbing fire, but he ignored it. He clawed his way up the hillside, dislodging small pebbles, his boots slipping on the loose shale. Below him, the firefight raged. He could hear Blake screaming orders, trying to regain control. He reached a small ledge, 30 feet above the clearing. Below him, he could see the muzzle flashes of Blake's men, huddled behind trees, trapped by the flanking fire from Luis and Caleb. He found what he was looking for, a large, precariously balanced boulder, the size of a wagon wheel. It was the keystone, holding a whole section of the slope in place. With a grunt of effort, he put his shoulder to it. It didn't budge. He tried again, his muscles screaming in protest, his wounded arm sending jolts of agony through his body. He thought of Catherine. He thought of Sarah Thompson. He thought of the boy, Daniel, fighting for his life in the darkness below. He let out a roar that was part rage, part grief, part pure desperation, and threw his entire weight against the rock. It shifted. Slowly at first, then with a deep groan, the hillside began to give way. The boulder tilted, broke free, and began to roll. It started an avalanche. A river of rock and dirt and splintered wood cascaded down the mountain, crashing through the trees where Blake's men were taking cover. The sound was deafening, a roar that shook the very ground. It was followed by screams of terror, then silence. When the dust settled, the clearing was transformed. Trees were snapped in half. The ground was a churned-up mess of rock and earth. 2 of Blake's men lay still. The others were gone, having fled into the night. But one figure remained, Theodore Blake. He stood near the edge of the rock slide, covered in dust, his fine clothes torn, his face a mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. His silver ring was gone, torn from his hand by the slide. He saw Mason on the hillside above him, and his face twisted into a snarl. He raised his pistol and fired. The bullet whizzed past Mason's ear. Mason didn't have his Colt. He dropped it during the climb. He was defenseless. But then, a figure emerged from the trees behind Blake. It was Caleb. Daniel. He held the empty derringer in one hand and a heavy rock in the other. "It's over," the boy said, his voice shaking but clear. "You lost." Blake slowly turned, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Lost? Don't be foolish, boy. You have no idea who I am." He took a step toward Caleb. "You should have stayed hidden. Now I have to finish what I started." "No," a new voice said. Sheriff Everett Howard stepped out of the woods, his own gun leveled at Blake. He wasn't alone. A dozen men from the mining camp, armed with rifles and pickaxes, emerged with him. The men Blake's money couldn't buy. The men who had finally chosen a side. Blake froze, his eyes darting from Howard to the miners, then back to Caleb. He was trapped. "It's over, Theodore," Howard said, his voice heavy with the weight of his own redemption. "The lies are done." Blake looked at Caleb, a strange, desperate light in his eyes. "You're my son," he hissed, the secret finally being weaponized. "You're a Blake. You belong to me." Caleb didn't flinch. He looked at the man who had murdered his mother, the man who had hunted him, the man who was his father, and he saw nothing but a monster. "My name," the boy said, his voice ringing with the strength of his mother, of Catherine, of Mason, "is Daniel Thompson, and you don't own me." The words broke Theodore Blake. The arrogance, the power, the confidence. It all crumbled, leaving behind a hollow, defeated man. He dropped his gun. Justice hadn't come from a courtroom or a judge. It had come from a mountain. It had come from a group of broken people who had refused to stay broken. As the miners took Blake into custody, Mason slid down the hillside. Luis and Tom emerged from the woods, bruised but alive. Caleb ran to Mason, his small body colliding with him in a fierce hug. "It's over," Mason whispered into the boy's hair, the words feeling real for the first time. "It's finally over." The trial of Theodore and Judge Blake was the biggest spectacle the territory had ever seen. The letters from Sarah Thompson were read aloud in a hushed courtroom. The cufflink and the flask were presented as undeniable proof. Eleanor Parker, Luis Mendoza, and Tom Riley all testified, their voices clear and strong, their truths finally unburdened by fear. But the most powerful testimony came from a 10-year-old boy named Daniel Thompson. He stood before the court and, in a quiet, steady voice, told the story of the fire. He told the story of the man with the silver ring. He told the story of a mother's love and a monster's cruelty. By the time he was done, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The Blakes were found guilty. Their power, once absolute, had been shattered by the truth. Months later, Mason and Daniel stood on a hill overlooking a small valley far from Ash Hollow. They had a new piece of land, a fresh start. Mason had sold his cabin, using the money to build a new home. Not a prison of grief, but a house of hope. "Do you think she can see us?" Daniel asked, looking up at the wide-open sky. He was sketching in Catherine's old book, his talent growing every day. "I think so," Mason said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I think they both can." The ghosts of the past were still there, but they were no longer haunting him. They were memories, warm and gentle. He had found a new purpose. He had found a son. They stood there for a long time, a former lawman and a brave boy, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Two survivors who had walked through fire and found a family on the other side. They had faced down the darkest parts of the world and had chosen to build something new in the light. It's a crazy world out there, and sometimes the only way to get justice is to make it yourself. The story of Mason Reed and Daniel Thompson is a reminder that even when things seem hopeless, even when the monsters seem to have all the power, courage and truth can still win the day. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of incredible survival and unbelievable justice, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you don't miss a single strange, dark, and mysterious story we have coming your way. Thanks for listening.